What would you do if your HOA fined you $1,000 for swimming in your own lake? What would you do if your HOA slapped you with a $1,000 fine just for touching the lake your family has owned for nearly a century? I thought it was a mistake, until I found forged maps, fake reports, and a developer trying to claim my water. And then someone warned me, "You have no idea who really wants that lake." The day the HOA decided to fine me $1,000 for touching my own lake started out almost painfully ordinary. By 5:30, the sun was dropping behind the ridgeline, pouring that soft gold light over Cedar Ridge Lake that made the water look like somebody spilled liquid emerald between the trees. My cabin sat on the quiet side of the lake, backed up against dense pines and scrub oak, a good mile from the shiny glass and stucco homes of Cedar Ridge Marina Estates across the water. Over there you saw chrome SUVs, white yachts, and Instagram sunsets. Over here you heard nothing but the wind in the needles and the creak of old wood. I'd spent the whole day hunched over a drafting table in my cabin office, going through flood control reports for a consulting job. Numbers, contour lines, and someone else's bad decisions about culverts. My shoulders were tight, my brain was buzzing, and the only cure I knew was the same one I'd used since I was 12 years old: a swim in my family's lake. I kicked off my work boots on the porch, peeled off my shirt, and walked down the weathered steps to the dock. The planks were rough under my bare feet, worn smooth in the spots my grandfather had stood to cast his line. The lake smelled like sun-warmed water and damp earth, with a faint trace of pine sap drifting down from the ridge. A light breeze put tiny ripples on the surface, catching bits of sky and turning them into broken shards of blue. I dove clean, cutting through the surface like a knife. For a second, there was nothing but cold and silence, the muffled thump of my own heartbeat in my ears. Then I came up, dragged a breath of cool air into my lungs, and floated on my back, staring up at the sky. A hawk traced lazy circles overhead. Somewhere behind me, a pickup door slammed on the gravel road. The rest of the world faded out. This lake had been in my family since 1931. My grandfather poured the first low dam with his own hands, then a real concrete structure 10 years later when the county got serious about flood control. I grew up on these banks. I knew every rock shelf, every stand of reeds, where the bass liked to hide when the sun got high. When he died, he left it all to me in a manila envelope with one line underlined on the deed: water rights retained by the Cole family in perpetuity. I swam out toward the middle, muscles loosening as the day's tension bled into the water. On the far side, the HOA community glowed in the evening light. Rows of big windowed houses stepping down to a manicured marina, white hulls bobbing on their slips. I could just make out the little security gate at the top of their private boat ramp, the tall metal letters over it that read Cedar Ridge Marina Estates. Their side had stone retaining walls, stainless steel ladders, and rules printed on laminated signs. My side had a crooked wooden fence, a faded private property Cole family sign my dad painted himself, and a dock whose posts had more history than any of those houses. After a few laps, I let myself drift back toward shore, treading water within a few feet of my ladder. The boards of the dock loomed above me, dark and familiar. I reached up, grabbed the rail, and started to haul myself out. That's when I heard the heels, tap, 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 sharp and out of place on old wood. I blinked the water out of my eyes and looked up. A silhouette blocked the sinking sun at the edge of the dock. As my vision cleared, the shape resolved into a woman in a bright pink blouse, pressed navy slacks, and wedges that had no business on a lakeside dock. Bethany Reed. I'd seen her around, usually across the water at HOA meetings on their community deck, or gliding through the marina with a clipboard and an air of quiet authority that said everything from the mailboxes to the color of your front door belonged to her. President of the Cedar Ridge Marina Estates Homeowners Association, mid-40s, blonde bob, The kind of posture that said she'd been in charge of every room she'd ever walked into. Right now, though, she wasn't quiet. She was furious. "Stop right there," she snapped, voice slicing through the still air. "Do not get out of that water." I froze halfway up the ladder, water streaming off my shoulders, my hands gripping the sun-warmed rail. "Evening," I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. "You're on private property." She ignored that completely. In her left hand, she clutched a slim black briefcase. In her right, a clipboard loaded with paper. The veins in her neck stood out as she leaned down toward me, eyes blazing. "You are actively contaminating the community watershed," she said, as if she were announcing my sentence in a courtroom. Per Section 12.6 of the Cedar Ridge Marina Estates Environmental Covenant, unauthorized swimming activities are strictly prohibited. I stared up at her, droplets of water dripping from my hair onto the ladder rungs. "Ma'am, this is my lake." "No," she shot back, jabbing a finger down toward the water so hard I half expected her to fall in after it. "This lake is part of our regulated watershed system. Your cabin is grandfathered into the subdivision boundary line, but all water features have been designated shared community assets. We sent multiple notices." "You sent notices to me," I said slowly, "telling me I can't swim in the lake my grandfather built?" Her smile went tight and thin, the kind of expression you see on people who believe they are absolutely, righteously correct. She flipped the top page on her clipboard with a practiced motion, then pulled out a form with a bright red stamp across the top. "Remington Cole," she read, pronouncing my full name like it tasted bad. "Violation: unauthorized swimming in regulated lake. Environmental impact fee: $1,000. Due in full within 30 days. Additional penalties accrue at $50 per day if unpaid." She held out the paper. For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. The whole thing felt surreal, the sun on my back, the cool water around my waist, and this woman in hot pink and wedges talking about regulated watershed systems on land my family had owned since before she was born. "You can't be serious," I said. "My deed says—" "We're not going to debate recorded covenants at the shoreline," she cut in, voice going colder. "If you have questions, you can bring them to the next board meeting. In the meantime, you are required to comply with community standards like everyone else." I let go of the ladder with one hand long enough to take the paper from her. The edges went damp where my fingers touched. A number, $1,000, stared up at me like it belonged on a car repair bill, not a piece of paper I'd just been handed for daring to touch my own water. On the far bank, a speedboat idled near the HOA marina, its engine rumbling softly. Kids' voices carried in the distance, laughter bouncing off the water. Here on my dock, the air felt suddenly heavy. "My family has held these water rights for almost 100 years, I said. I heard the steel in my own voice, felt the old stubborn coal streak waking up in my chest. "You don't get to stroll onto my dock and tell me I'm trespassing in my own lake." Bethany's jaw tightened. For a heartbeat, something flickered in her eyes. Nervousness, maybe, but it vanished under another layer of polished authority. "Mr. Cole, your cabin is a legacy property," she said. "I understand that may be emotionally meaningful to you, but Cedar Ridge has changed. We have professionals living here now, retirees who paid good money for tranquility and high environmental standards. Your activities are inconsistent with the image and safety requirements our residents expect." I looked down at myself. Bare chest, board shorts, water still dripping back into the lake my grandfather built. I looked back up at her. "Swimming?" I asked. "You're calling swimming inconsistent with your image?" "Unregulated human contact with the water introduces oils, soaps, and bacteria," she replied, as if reading from a script. "We have invested thousands of dollars in maintaining this lake's clarity. Your noncompliance puts that at risk." The only thing putting this lake at risk is the dock full of gas-powered toys on your side, I muttered. Her eyes narrowed. Excuse me? I shook my head. Nothing. Look, you're wrong about the water rights, and about who owns what here. I've got the deed and the county maps to prove it. Then by all means, she said coolly, straightening up, pink blouse catching the last of the sunlight. Bring your little papers to the board. Until then, consider yourself formally notified. Any further swimming will be considered willful violation, and fines will escalate accordingly. She snapped her briefcase shut with a sharp metallic click that seemed louder than it had any right to in the quiet evening. Then she turned and strode back down the dock, heels clacking on the old planks, leaving a faint trail of expensive perfume hanging in the air behind her. I watched her go, that $1,000 piece of paper wilting in my wet hand. The breeze picked up, riffling the edges. Somewhere out on the lake a fish jumped, leaving a circle of ripples that spread toward the marina, toward the polished boats and the stamped concrete walks, and the people who thought they owned my horizon. My grandfather's voice echoed in my head, from a long-ago day when he'd pressed that deed into my 16-year-old hands. Don't let anyone tell you different, Remy. This water is ours, bought and paid for. They can build whatever they want around it. They don't own what's underneath. I climbed the rest of the way onto the dock, bare feet slapping the warm boards, and looked down at the violation notice again. $1,000. For a swim. Shock was giving way to something else now, something hotter and heavier that settled in my chest like a coiled spring. Across the lake, the HOA's marina lights flickered on one by one, small white dots reflected in the darkening water. For the first time since they built those houses, I found myself looking at that side of the shore not as neighbors, but as people who thought they'd found a way to take what wasn't theirs. I folded the notice carefully, water stains and all, and tucked it under my arm as I headed back up toward the cabin. Why on earth would an HOA dare fine the actual lake owner for touching his own water? I had a feeling I was about to find out. The next morning was colder than usual, the kind that made the pine needles shine silver. I stepped out onto my porch with a mug of coffee and the violation notice lying on the railing, like an unwanted guest. The steam rising from the cup curled into the still air, and for a moment I let myself believe last night had been a strange dream. Then I saw them. 3 men in neon vests stood along my shoreline near the old cedar stump, driving metal stakes into the earth. Another unrolled a long yellow tape across the ground, marking something in bright segments that cut through my property like battle lines. A white pickup with the HOA logo sat on the gravel near the split-rail fence. Surveyors. On my land. Without a word to me. I walked down the slope, boots crunching over frosted grass. "Can I help you fellas with something?" I asked. The tallest one didn't even bother looking up from his clipboard. "HOA survey order," he said. "Boundary verification for shoreline regulation." "Funny," I replied. "I don't remember signing anything that lets the HOA survey my property." He tapped his badge holder as if that answered the universe. All residents were notified. "Resident, sure," I said. "Owner of the lake? Never." That made him look up. His eyes flicked to the notice in my hand, still crinkled from last night. "If you have concerns, take them up with your association president." That did it. A thin thread of anger tightened behind my ribs. "My family built this lake," I said, stepping closer. "You're on my land. You don't get to plant stakes here unless you can show me a court order, a county permit, or a deed with my signature on it." He hesitated just long enough to confirm what I already suspected. They had none of those things. "Sir," he finally said, "we're just doing our job." "Then do it somewhere else." They stood there for a beat, conferring quietly, before rolling up their tape and retrieving their stakes. The tallest man muttered something about miscommunication, but I knew better. This wasn't confusion. This was coordinated. And coordinated meant planned. I headed back toward the cabin, the violation notice now buzzing in my mind like a hornet. Before I reached the steps, the crunch of tires on gravel made me turn. Marcus Hale's sheriff SUV rolled up beside the mailbox, dust swirling in the morning sun. Marcus stepped out, adjusting his brimmed hat against the glare. "You look like a man who didn't get much sleep," he said. "HOA trouble," I replied, handing him the notice. He read it, one eyebrow climbing halfway to his hairline. $1,000? For swimming? For unauthorized water contact, I corrected. Marcus let out a whistle and folded the paper. "Bethany's been pushing harder than usual lately. Got half the community complaining about new rules nobody agreed to." He paused, then added, "Heard there were survey crews down here this morning." "They said boundary verification," I said, "for shoreline regulation." His jaw tightened. "That wasn't run through the county." I figured as much. Marcus leaned one hand on the hood of his SUV. "Remy, last month the HOA board pushed a rewrite through while half the residents were out of state. Buried in that rewrite was a clause saying the lake falls under their Community Environmental Management District." I stared at him. "That's impossible. They can't supersede a recorded water deed." "That's what I told him," he said. "They told me to stay in my lane." The cold morning felt colder. "So they think they own the lake now. They think they can claim it," he corrected. "Big difference for now." I ran a hand through my hair. "Why would an HOA go to this much trouble over water they don't own?" Marcus shifted his jaw, the way he did when deciding how much truth to share. "Rumor is, someone's been sniffing around about expanding the marina. Big developer. Big money." A slow, unwelcome understanding crept over me. "That's why they need shoreline control," I murmured. Marcus nodded once. "And you're standing in their way." Long after he left, I stayed on the porch, staring out at the lake as thin fog curled across its surface. My grandfather's handwriting flashed through my mind. The tight, deliberate script on the original deed stored in my safe. Cole family water rights, unrestricted use, untransferable without consent. They could laminate every rulebook in the world, and it wouldn't erase that line. But the stakes on my shoreline said they were going to try. Around noon, I pulled out the old HOA handbook from a dusty crate, something I'd barely skimmed when I moved in. Most of it was predictable: paint colors, boat noise limits, landscaping etiquette. But halfway through, I found it. A new section titled Watershed Shared Use Covenant. A covenant I had never signed. A covenant giving the HOA administrative oversight of all water features within the Cedar Ridge Aesthetic Zone. Aesthetic Zone. They weren't even pretending this was about science. As I flipped the pages, my pulse picked up. The handwriting was familiar. Not mine, not any neighbors. Bethany's neat loops and razor-straight margins. At the bottom of page 29, I found something worse. A dotted line labeled Legacy Property Owner Acknowledgement. Empty. Untouched. Not signed by me. A knot tightened in my stomach. Across the lake, the marina shimmered in the afternoon sun. Boats drifted at their moorings. HOA residents walked along the docks, sipping iced drinks, waving to each other like the world was exactly how they wanted it. Maybe for them it was. For me, something was shifting under the surface. Quiet, deliberate, and dangerous. I closed the handbook, set it on the table, and stared out at the green water. Calm as glass. If they were willing to rewrite covenants, send surveyors, and slap fines without the law on their side, what would they try next? I didn't have to wait long to find out. The following morning, before the sun had burned off the mist on the lake, a sharp knock rattled my cabin door. I opened it to find a thin white envelope stuck under a magnetic clipboard attached neatly to the railing, HOA seal stamped in shiny blue. No visitor. No explanation. Just the envelope, fluttering slightly in the early breeze. Inside was another violation. $250. Noise pollution. Excessive splashing. A printed note underneath read, "Lake disturbance recorded by residents during early morning hours. Considerate behavior expected." I let out a breath somewhere between a laugh and disbelief. Excessive splashing? There were beavers in this lake making more noise than I ever could. The morning air smelled faintly of damp earth and cedar bark, the lake still wrapped in the last threads of fog. And yet here I stood, holding a piece of paper telling me my presence was somehow disturbing the peace. I walked down the dock, shaking my head, and skimmed stones across the water, just to hear the sound of something natural for a moment. When the last ripple faded, I caught movement across the lake. Someone on the HOA marina with a camera phone pointed straight toward my property. I raised a hand to shade my eyes. The figure quickly turned away. Surveillance now. Wonderful. 2 hours later, as the sun climbed higher, another knock came, this time sharp, impatient, carrying the scent of perfume before I even opened the door. Bethany Reed stood on my porch again, clipboard hugged tight, lips pursed in practiced authority. "Morning, Mr. Cole," she said brightly, as though yesterday's confrontation had been a friendly chat. "I'm here for a follow-up inspection." "Inspection of what?" I asked. "Your dock, your shoreline, your vessel storage." Her tone quickened with each item. "Routine procedure." "Routine. Sure." I stepped aside, offering no invitation, but also giving her nothing to twist into refusal. She clicked down the porch steps, heels tapping, and began photographing the wooden dock from every angle. The same dock that had been there since 1968, unchanged except for new planks I installed 5 years ago. She paused, frowning at one of the older support posts, the one with my grandfather's initials carved near the top. "This structure," she declared, "is unauthorized." "It's 60 years old," I said, "long before your HOA existed." "That may be," she replied, tapping her tablet, "but updates or repairs classify it as a new structure requiring approval." "I paid for one replacement plank," I said. "That's maintenance. Not according to HOA code." I exhaled slowly, keeping my voice level. "Bethany, this isn't your jurisdiction." She held up a small electronic device, plastic, with a blinking green light, and waved it theatrically over the dock, then over the water. "My meter says otherwise." I stared at the object. It looked suspiciously like a toy-grade environment tester, the kind sold online for less than $20. "That doesn't measure anything," I said. "It measures contamination levels," she insisted. "It measures battery life," I corrected. "Maybe temperature if you're lucky." Her jaw twitched. "Mr. Cole, continuing this tone will not help your case." "Which case is that?" I asked. "The imaginary one?" Her cheeks flushed a controlled shade of pink. She typed something into her tablet with clipped keystrokes, then produced a fresh form from her clipboard. $450. Unauthorized dock modification. I took the paper without speaking. Water from the lake last night had dried into faint ridges on yesterday's fine. Today's notice crisped in the cool air, as though eager to join it. "This will continue," Bethany said, "until you comply with..." "With what?" I asked quietly. "With giving up my shoreline?" She froze, just for a heartbeat, but I saw the truth catch in her eyes like a fishing hook snagged on a submerged branch. Her fingers tightened around the clipboard. She lifted her chin and cleared her throat. "I'm simply enforcing regulations. And I'm simply standing on land I own." The standoff hung between us, thinner than the morning mist. Then, from behind us, a warm baritone voice called out, Everything all right here? I turned. Jake Carter, a local boat mechanic and friend of mine, stood at the edge of my gravel driveway, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag. His old blue pickup idled behind him, fishing poles sticking out the back window. Bethany gave him a tight smile. Association business. Jake raised an eyebrow. Funny. Didn't know your association extended onto Remy's private dock. That's debatable, she snapped. No, Jake said, crossing his arms. It really ain't. Bethany drew in a breath, pressed her lips into a preventative smile, and pivoted away. Expect additional documentation soon, Mr. Cole. She strode off toward her SUV, each step chopping the gravel like a metronome of irritation. When she drove off, dust spiraled behind her in the cold morning sun. Jake whistled low. Boy, she's really got your number. I think she wants the whole lake, I said. He paused mid-wipe. You serious? They rewrote covenants, sent surveyors. Now this. I lifted the fresh violation. 3 fines in 2 days. Jake let out a breath. Someone's building a case, and they're hoping you crack. I looked down at the 2 notices in my hand, the edges fluttering in the slight breeze coming off the water. Behind Jake, sunlight glinted off his pickup's hood, catching the faded dent where a deer had run into him last fall. Ordinary things. Things that made sense. None of this made sense. As Jake climbed back into his truck, he leaned out the window. You're not alone, Remy. Holler if you need help. Thanks, I said, quietly. After he left, I walked back down to the shoreline. The lake barely rippled. The air smelled of pine, sun-warmed bark, and something else now. Pressure. Like a storm gathering without clouds. Across the water, a woman on the HOA side raised her phone and snapped another photo of my dock. Whatever this was, it wasn't random, and it wasn't stopping. By late afternoon, I had 3 envelopes taped to my front door. No knock, no courtesy, just sticky notes with the same HOA seal, neatly stacked like they were proud of leaving them there. I peeled the first one open. $180. Unsecured canoe creating visual obstruction. The canoe had been in the same place for 20 years. Next envelope. $320. Shoreline erosion responsibility fee. As if I was personally eroding the land with my thoughts. And the final one. Warning notice. Failure to comply with watershed behavior standards. The phrasing alone made my teeth clench. Watershed behavior. Like I was some unruly student ruining their perfect classroom. I set the stack of papers on the table, stared at them for a long minute, then reached for my phone. There were 2 people in the world who knew more about water law than anyone else I'd met, my grandfather and Sarah Mitchell. One was 6 years gone. The other still owed me a beer from a conference 3 years back. I scrolled through my contacts until I found her name and hit call. She picked up on the second ring. Well, she said, her voice bright but edged. If it isn't the only dam engineer I know who voluntarily retired before 50. What's going on, Remy? HOA trouble, I said, and not the kind you can ignore. Her tone shifted instantly. Tell me. I walked her through everything. The $1,000 fine, the phony contamination meter, the sudden covenant rewrite, the survey stakes, the escalating violations. With each detail, her silence got heavier. Remy, she finally said, this isn't enforcement. This is strategy. Strategy for what? To push you into a legal corner, she replied. Or to create a record of non-compliance they can use against you. I rubbed the bridge of my nose. They think they own the lake. That part, she said, is impossible. Water rights override HOA bylaws. County codes override HOA bylaws. A deed like yours? It overrides almost everything. Tell that to the pink hurricane running the HOA. she snorted. Bethany Reed? I know her type. They rely on intimidation and paperwork overload. But something's off. HOAs don't usually try to expand authority over water features. They avoid liability like poison. She's either desperate or confident, I said. Or both, Sarah offered. Either way, I need to see what they filed. There was a rustle of papers through the phone. I could picture her scanning her desk, glasses halfway down her nose, hair pinned up the way she wore it when she meant business. Email me photos of every violation, she said. Every document, every envelope, and I'll check the county portal for filings. You think they submitted something official? If they didn't, she said, that's a crime. If they did, they overstepped. Either way, they're wrong. Her certainty loosened something tight in my chest. I hadn't realized how much tension I'd been carrying until I heard her voice, steady, practical, cutting through the noise. I'll send them tonight, I said. And Remy? Yeah? Don't talk to them again until I look at everything. HOA presidents are predictable. They'll try to corner you into admitting something you didn't do. I laughed softly. Like swimming? Exactly like swimming. After we hung up, I stepped onto the porch again. The sun was lowering, the lake glowing like a sheet of polished glass. Dragonflies skimmed the surface. A breeze carried the smell of distant wood smoke. It should have been peaceful. It always had been. But tonight, the lake felt like it was holding its breath. I gathered the HOA's papers into a neat stack and brought them to my desk. My grandfather's old water deed sat in the same drawer as always, folded around decades of lake maps and maintenance notes. I pulled it out, smoothed the aging paper, and traced the ink where his steady hand had written, "Unrestricted water rights retained by Cole family." Unrestricted, clear, undeniable. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Found something. Call me. My pulse picked up. I hit call immediately. She answered on the first ring. Remy, listen carefully, she said, voice lower now. I checked the county database. 3 months ago, someone submitted an amendment claiming the lake is part of a shared watershed district. It references a signature page, but your signature isn't there. I never saw a signature page. Exactly, she said. But the amendment lists your parcel number anyway. So they filed a document tying my property to the HOA without my signature. Yes, she said, and that's illegal. A branch snapped outside. I turned toward the porch window but saw nothing except shadows. Remy, she continued, I've seen schemes like this before. Not often, but enough to recognize them. Someone is trying to build a paper trail that says you agreed to surrender partial water rights, slip it through unnoticed, make it look official. Why? What's the endgame? Her answer came soft, deliberate. Developers, she said. The only people who benefit when water rights change hands. A chill crept up my spine. Marcus mentioned something about that. Then listen to him, she replied. He knows more about political pressure than most sheriffs. And this level of effort? It isn't about your swimming. It's about control of the lake. I exhaled slowly. The papers in front of me blurred at the edges. My hand tightened around the phone. Remy, she said gently, you need to let me handle the legal side. Don't confront Bethany. Don't sign anything. Don't acknowledge anything. Just gather what you can and stay calm. A faint knock sounded on my door, soft, quick, like someone tapping with just their knuckles. I turned toward it. Sarah, I whispered, someone's here. Don't open it unless you know who it is. I approached quietly and peered through the small window beside the frame. Nothing. No person. Only an envelope resting against the door. I opened it cautiously. Inside was a single sheet of paper. Notice of intent to fine. Failure to maintain water clarity. Water clarity? As if my breathing was polluting the lake. But at the bottom of the page, handwritten in delicate, looping script, was a new line. Further non-compliance will result in legal action. Legal action. I crumpled the paper in my fist. Across the water, the marina lights flickered on again. But for the first time, they didn't look like lights. They looked like eyes. "Sarah," I said quietly, "I think this just escalated." The next morning, frost clung to the edges of the grass like a thin coat of silver paint. I stepped outside with a mug of coffee, still thinking about last night's threat, when I heard the low rumble of an engine on the gravel road. Marcus's sheriff SUV rolled into view, sunlight hitting the windshield in a flash that made him look like a silhouette behind the wheel. He parked beside my fence and stepped out, thumb hooked on his duty belt, the way he always stood when he had something serious to say. "Morning, Remy," he called. "Morning," I answered, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "You here to give me a speeding ticket for walking too fast near the shoreline?" He cracked a faint smile, then shook his head. "Wish that was the problem." He motioned toward the SUV. "You better see this." Inside, on the passenger seat, was a manila folder. Thick, worn at the corners, sealed with a rubber band. Marcus pulled it open and slid it toward me. Inside were pages printed from emails, meeting minutes, and glossy concept images. The first page hit me like a punch. Cedar Ridge Premiere. Marina expansion. Proposed project overview. I felt my throat tighten. Artist renderings showed a massive wooden pier stretching far into the lake, yacht slips doubling in number, a lakeside boardwalk, and a glass-walled clubhouse overlooking the water. All of it was pressed into the lake like a hand pushing down on a map. My lake. I flipped the next page. A memo from Bethany to a developer named Harper and Lyle Properties. Pending successful acquisition of shoreline and water access rights, Phase 1 construction can begin as early as fall. Acquisition. They weren't even hiding the word. My fingers tightened on the edge of the paper. "Where did you get this?" "County Planning Office," Marcus replied quietly. "Someone slipped it into my inbox this morning. No name, no note, just this file." I looked at him. "Harper and Lyle. That's a big outfit." "Bigger than this whole county," he said. "And they don't move unless they're already sure they're going to get what they want. Which means they think they already have the lake," I finished. He nodded. "Remy, those survey stakes they put in? That wasn't exploratory. That was Phase 0, pre-construction evaluation. They're prepping to redraw lake boundaries." A cold wave washed through me, colder than the lake itself. I stared at the glossy renderings, yachts lined up like enamel teeth, boardwalk lights glowing, a walkway cutting across the exact spot where I used to fish with my grandfather, all of it drawn on my water. "They're planning to drown me in fines," I said slowly, "until I either give up or look like a non-compliant property owner in court." Marcus leaned against the SUV. "Exactly. Bethany's job is to make you look like the problem. The developer's job is to swoop in with a solution. And if they get those rights, they'll bulldoze half your shoreline." The wind stirred, carrying the scent of pine and something faintly metallic. Across the lake, the HOA marina looked peaceful. White boats bobbing softly, sunlight shimmering off their hulls. If you didn't know better, you'd never see the tension crawling beneath that calm surface. "Why me?" I muttered. "Why this lake?" Marcus sighed. "Because it's a gold mine. The HOA's side is boxed in by zoning. They can't expand unless they control deeper water. Your side is the only feasible direction." He flipped another page for me. This one had a map, survey lines cutting through my property like surgical incisions. The planned dock expansion went 50 yards into my water, and stamped at the bottom, pending approval. Pending, I echoed, meaning they're acting like it's already theirs. You're catching on. I let the papers rest in my lap, staring through the windshield at the lake. A light haze drifted above the water, making the surface look unreal, like something painted on glass. I remembered my grandfather's voice. They can build the world around you, Remy, but they can't build on top of what you own unless you let them. Well, they were trying. I closed the folder. Sarah needs to see this. She will, Marcus said. I'll send copies. But before you go charging in guns blazing. No guns, I snapped. Just the deed. He nodded approvingly. Good, because this isn't just Bethany. She's the face. Someone else is pulling the strings. I looked at the marina again. Boats drifted lazily, their reflections wavering on the water. But it all felt staged now, like a set built on a foundation of paperwork, lies, and quiet ambition. Remy, Marcus added softly, this is bigger than a fine. Bigger than an HOA. They want your lake. And they're counting on you not fighting back. I stood there a long moment, letting the truth settle like silt in deep water. Then I said, they picked the wrong engineer. Later that evening, after scanning every document and emailing everything to Sarah, I sat on my dock as the sun dipped behind the ridge. The boards were warm under my legs, smelling faintly of old cedar and lake water. Dragonflies darted over the surface, their wings catching flashes of gold. Everything about the moment was peaceful. Except my mind. A quiet lake, a quiet cabin, a quiet man. I'd always thought quiet living was safety. But the stillness had been disturbed. Something deliberate was moving beneath it. A soft splash drew my attention. A white yacht drifted closer to the HOA borderline, its chrome rails catching the last light. Two men stood on deck, talking quietly, pointing toward my side of the lake. One of them held a clipboard. They didn't see me watching. Or maybe they did. The yacht turned slowly and motored back toward the marina, leaving only ripples behind. I felt the folder's weight in my memory. The diagrams, the expansions, the phrases like acquisition strategy and shoreline restructuring. Whatever they were planning, I wasn't going to let them build it on top of my family's water. The next morning dawned strangely quiet. Not peaceful. Quiet in that thick, expectant way a forest gets before lightning cracks the sky. Even the birds seemed to chirp softer, like they sensed the tension running under the ground. I made coffee and opened the old chest beneath my cabin window. Inside were the documents that mattered most. My grandfather's deed, the original hydrology reports from the 1940s dam construction, and maps hand-drawn with careful, engineer-worthy precision. The paper smelled of age, dust, ink, and lake mist soaked into the fibers over decades. I spread everything across my dining table, sunlight sliding through the window and catching the edges of brittle parchment. Every line, every measurement, every notation confirmed the same thing. The Cole family owned this water, every inch, every drop, every stone on the lakebed. I ran my fingers over my grandfather's handwriting. Even after all these years, his pen strokes carried a steadiness I could almost feel in my bones. He'd fought for these rights long before I was born. Now it was my turn. My phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. Reviewing everything. Preparing counteraction. Sit tight. Do not respond to HOA communications. Another from Marcus, 15 seconds later. County clerk says HOA requested emergency zoning review. Stay sharp. Emergency zoning review. They were accelerating the plan. I exhaled and leaned back. All right, I murmured to myself. If it's a storm they want. I spent the next hour sorting the documents into piles. Legal, historical, engineering. The old hydrology map showed the natural contour of the lake before the marina dredged their side. The deed confirmed shoreline ownership. The survey my grandfather paid for in 1972 proved the lake's bedrock boundary. Every piece was ammunition. By noon, clouds rolled in over the ridge, low and gray, the kind that make the water look darker and deeper than usual. From my porch, I watched as a few HOA residents drifted along their marina walkway, umbrellas in hand, pausing occasionally to look toward my side of the lake. One woman raised her phone and took another picture. I pretended not to see. It wasn't time to react. Not yet. That was the point of today. Silence. Patience. Calm before the storm. At 2 o'clock, a white HOA-branded golf cart rolled to the edge of my driveway. No one got out. Instead, someone reached out, placed a fresh envelope on the fence post, and drove off in reverse like they didn't want to risk turning their back to my cabane. I waited until they vanished before retrieving it. Inside, notice of potential litigation. Failure to adhere to watershed compliance. My jaw tightened. This one wasn't signed by Bethany. It carried a typed name instead. Harper and Lyle Properties, Municipal Coordination Division. So the developer was no longer staying in the shadows. They were stepping onto the stage. Lightning flickered somewhere over the ridge. A soft rumble followed, rolling across the lake. I sat on the porch with the envelope, letting the thunder fade. Then I tore it in half and set it aside. Not out of anger, out of certainty. Sarah had told me not to respond until she finished preparing the counterattack. And if there was one rule I trusted her with, it was timing. Around 3, I heard the crunch of tires again, slow, measured, familiar. Marcus's sheriff SUV pulled up in front of the cabin. He stepped out carrying a small cardboard box. "Got something for you," he said. "What is it?" He placed it on the porch table. Inside was a little recording device, barely the size of a deck of cards. "Just in case," he said. "You think they'll try something?" "I think," he said, adjusting his hat. "People who are desperate tend to talk too much, especially when they think they're about to win." I nodded and pocketed the device. Marcus studied me for a moment. "You're awfully calm." "I have to be. Storm's coming." He cracked a small grin. "Well, you let me know when it hits. I'll bring an umbrella big enough for both of us." When he left, I stood on the dock as the lake darkened under thickening clouds. Wind rippled the water, carrying tiny waves toward the old wooden posts. Somewhere across the lake, a metal gate clanged shut, a sharp, hollow sound echoing over Matern. The HOA was stirring. So was the developer. And I was staying quiet. Not out of fear, but strategy. For 2 full days, I didn't respond to a single notice. Didn't confront Bethany. Didn't retrieve envelopes until hours after they appeared. From their perspective, it must have looked like surrender. A man overwhelmed by pressure. A legacy owner finally bending. I wanted them to believe exactly that. Because people reveal the most when they think the battle is already won. On the evening of the second day, as rain tapped steadily against my cabin roof, a voice carried faintly across the water. It echoed just enough for me to catch fragments. Once rights transfer. Construction begins. He won't have any standing. Standing. They thought I wouldn't have standing. I smiled, a slow, tired smile. The storm clouds parted just enough for a sliver of light to strike the lake, turning the rain into silver needles. It was strangely beautiful, even in the tension. I looked down at the deed again, edges curled from age, ink dark against yellowed paper. Standing was exactly what I had. But they didn't need to know that yet. By the next morning, the whole lake felt different. The air held a sharper bite. The wind came in short bursts, sending tiny waves tapping against my dock like impatient fingers. Even the birds seemed to fly lower, closer to the treetops, as if sensing that something heavy was about to break loose. At 9:12 a.m., I heard the sound that confirmed it. A bullhorn. It echoed across the water, thin, metallic, and entirely out of place on a quiet lakeshore. I stepped onto my porch and saw a small crowd gathering at the HOA marina. People in rain jackets and fleece vests trickled onto the long central dock, their footsteps clacking on the wet boards. A few held umbrellas. Others clutched steaming mugs from the fancy coffee kiosk the HOA installed last year. Even at a distance, I could recognize the mix of curiosity, irritation, and smug satisfaction. Bethany Reed stood at the center of it all, clipboard in one hand, bullhorn in the other, bright pink blouse impossible to miss even from across the lake. Behind her, 2 HOA board members huddled like anxious bookends. And farther back, leaning on the railing with arms crossed, the same developer rep I'd seen on the yacht earlier that week. Their eyes weren't on the crowd. They were on my cabin. Then the bullhorn crackled. "Mr. Cole," Bethany called, voice amplified across the water. "Attendance is required for shoreline compliance review." "Required, sure." I let the bullhorn's shrill feedback fade before walking slowly down to my dock. Rainwater beaded on the planks, glistening like a fresh coat of varnish. My boots made hollow thuds as I stepped to the end. A hush fell across the marina dock. Even from a distance, I felt dozens of eyes snap toward me. Someone muttered. Someone else raised a phone. Let them film. They'd want the footage later. Bethany lifted the bullhorn again. "Please approach the central dock for the formal review." I cupped my hands around my mouth. "I'll come by boat." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd at that. I untied my small aluminum skiff, the same one my dad used to take me fishing in. The metal felt cold under my palm, the rope slick with last night's rain. As I pushed off from the dock, the motor hummed to life with a low, steady vibration that sent tiny ripples spreading across the otherwise placid surface. Crossing the lake, I felt the weight of generations behind me. My grandfather's penciled maps, my father's calloused hands tightening bolts on the dock, the deed resting safely in my jacket. Everything they built now converged in one place, a marina full of people who wanted to pretend the water beneath them belonged to someone else. I slid the skiff against the HOA dock, tied the rope loosely, and climbed up onto the boards. A few HOA residents stepped back as if I'd dragged contamination with me on my boots. Bethany didn't step back. She stepped forward. "Mr. Cole," she said crisply, rain dripping from the brim of her immaculate hat, "we've convened an emergency compliance review due to repeated violations of watershed standards." I nodded once. I heard the bullhorn. "This proceeding," she continued, projecting her voice for the gathered crowd, "is meant to determine whether your property's misuse of lake resources constitutes grounds for corrective action." Corrective action. A sterile phrase hiding a very sharp blade. Before I could respond, footsteps echoed behind me. Sarah Mitchell stepped onto the dock, hair tied back, coat buttoned tight, a leather satchel slung over her shoulder. She moved calmly, almost casually, but every step radiated purpose. Marcus Hale followed her a moment later, uniform neat despite the drizzle, hand resting on his belt, as if ready to separate arguments before they turned into something worse. "Good," Sarah murmured, brushing rain off her glasses. "We're right on time." Bethany's eyes widened for a fraction of a second, just enough for me to catch. She hadn't expected company. "This is a private HOA meeting," Bethany said sharply. Sarah raised a hand. "And this is a public lakebed governed by recorded water rights. You'll want to hear what we brought." I opened my satchel and took out the deed, the original copy, sealed in a protective sleeve. Even through the plastic, the signature ink looked strong, like it had been written yesterday instead of half a century ago. Bethany's face paled. "This document," Sarah announced, holding it up just long enough for cameras to catch it, "confirms that Mr. Cole owns 80% of the lake and all submerged land beneath it. That includes every inch beneath your marina." Gasps scattered across the crowd like startled birds. Sarah continued, her voice steady. "Meaning every fine you've issued for unauthorized water contact, every violation for dock use, every claim of watershed intrusion. All of it is outside your jurisdiction." One of the board members whispered urgently to Bethany. She ignored him, jaw tightening as she tried to regain footing. "That doesn't change the environmental impact concerns," she said, but her voice shook at the edges. "Actually," Sarah replied, pulling another document from her satchel, "it changes everything." She handed the paper to Marcus. He stepped forward, flipping it open for all to see. Even from several feet away, the HOA letterhead was unmistakable. "This," Marcus said, tapping the page, "is evidence showing that HOA funds labeled as environmental fees were transferred to a shell company registered under the name Reed and Associates." A heavy silence dropped onto the dock. Rain pattered softly on jackets and umbrellas, but no one spoke. "Reed," a man whispered sharply. "As in Bethany Reed?" Sarah nodded. "We have bank records confirming the transfers." Bethany finally snapped. "This is outrageous. Those were vendor reimbursements for lake maintenance, all fully authorized by the board." "Funny," Marcus replied, "because the county has no record of any maintenance permits filed under that company, or any company performing environmental work on this lake." I watched her throat tighten. Her fingers dug into her clipboard. Her eyes darted toward the developer rep at the back of the crowd, but he avoided her gaze completely. That told me everything. Bethany was on her own. "Furthermore," Sarah said, voice like sharpened glass, "you filed an amendment claiming shared watershed control without Mr. Cole's signature. That is forgery, and grounds for criminal investigation." Murmurs rose into a wave. She forged signatures. The president forged legal documents. What else has she lied about? Bethany's composure finally cracked. I was advised." "By who?" I asked. The question hit the dock like a dropped anchor. Bethany's mouth opened, closed, opened again. The truth hovered there, visible, trembling, ready to fall. But she didn't speak. She didn't have to. Marcus stepped forward, placing a hand gently but firmly on her arm. "Mrs. Reed, effective immediately. You are under county investigation. I need you to come with me." Gasps, whispers, the shuffle of retreating feet, all of it blurred together. Bethany recoiled, not violently, but in pure disbelief. Her clipboard slipped from her fingers and hit the dock with a flat slap. For the first time since this mess began, she looked small and scared. I didn't feel triumphant. Not yet. Because something in her expression wasn't fear of being caught. It was fear of whoever had put her up to it. As Marcus guided her toward the dock's edge, she twisted back toward me and said under her breath, but loud enough for only one person to hear, "This wasn't my idea. You don't understand who wants your lake." A chill crawled up my spine. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning. I watched her disappear down the dock, rain misting around her like a gray veil. The crowd buzzed with confusion, some angry, some bewildered, some whispering frantically into their phones. The marina lights flickered on against the overcast sky, casting long, shimmering reflections across the water. Sarah stepped beside me. "Did you hear what she said?" "Yeah," I murmured, "and it didn't sound rehearsed." "No," Sarah agreed quietly. "That was fear." Fear of what or who? Before I could answer, a presence stepped forward from the back of the dock. A man in a charcoal coat, crisp slacks, polished shoes. He held no umbrella despite the drizzle, letting the rain bead on his shoulders like it didn't dare cling too long. Brown hair, neatly combed, clean-shaven, eyes cool as winter water. The developer rep. I recognized him even before he spoke. "Mr. Cole," he said, offering a hand he clearly didn't expect me to take. "Evan Larkin, Harper and Lyle Properties." I didn't take the hand. Something icy flickered across his expression before it reset into a polite curve. Sarah stepped forward. "This meeting is over. Any further discussion must happen through legal counsel." But Larkin didn't look at her. He looked at me. "Impressive presentation," he said, voice smooth, barely raising above the soft slap of water against the pilings. "Though if you're planning to hold this entire community hostage with outdated deeds and legacy filings, you may find resistance stronger than you expect." Sarah bristled. "Hostage? He owns the land. You can't expand your marina without his consent." Larkin smiled faintly. "Consent," he repeated, as though the word tasted humorous. "Consent is negotiable when progress is on the table." I took a step forward. "Progress doesn't involve forgery." "Forgeries," he said calmly, "are allegations. Development, meanwhile, is certainty. Jobs, revenue, tourism, stability." "And destruction," I replied. "Of a lake ecosystem you don't understand, and a shoreline you don't own." His jaw tightened by the smallest fraction. "Ownership is flexible." I almost laughed. "Not this time." Larkin leaned in slightly, not enough for the crowd to notice, but enough for me to see the cold edge beneath his polished calm. "Careful, Mr. Cole," he said softly. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Lakes change hands all the time, even stubborn ones." Sarah stepped between us, blocking his view. "This conversation is over." Larkin looked past her, straight at me again, then gave a small nod, the kind people give when noting a variable that must be eliminated later. Then he turned and walked away, rain tracing lines down his coat. Not hurried, not rattled, just patient. A patient man with a large company behind him. Behind me, HOA residents murmured in growing panic as word spread that Bethany had been led away for questioning. Some looked betrayed. Others looked relieved. Others looked frightened, like they had just discovered they were pawns in something bigger than home paint colors and community potlucks. When the crowd finally dispersed, the marina grew quiet. Boats rocked softly. A heron lifted off from a piling with a slow flap of wings. The storm clouds thinned, letting dim, late-afternoon sun smear gold across the water. Sarah walked with me back to my skiff. "That man," she said, shaking her head, "knows exactly what he's doing." "Yeah," I replied, "and he's not done." "Developers don't stop just because one plan collapses," she warned. "They pivot. They push harder." I pushed off from the dock and started the motor. "Good," I said. "So do I." As I crossed the water back to my cabin, a strange tension hung in the air. The lake, usually my refuge, felt like a battlefield settling between rounds. The wind had softened, carrying the smell of wet pine and stirred silt. My wake spread behind me in widening arcs, rippling under the heavy quiet. There was no triumph in me. Not yet. Only awareness. I docked my skiff and walked up the slope to my cabin. On the porch railing sat another envelope. Thin, white. Alone. No seal. No HOA stamp. Just my name written in a sharp, slanted script. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single printed email excerpt. "Finalize acquisition strategy. HOA president compliant but unreliable. Initiate secondary pressure plan if landowner does not capitulate. Below that, handwritten in the same script, you're not dealing with the HOA anymore. No signature, no sender, just a closing line that made the air around me feel colder. We finish what we start. The lake behind me lapped gently at the dock, but suddenly it didn't feel gentle. It felt watched. The next 48 hours moved with the strange stillness of a held breath. No new envelopes appeared on my door. No survey teams crept along my shoreline. Even Bethany's SUV vanished from its usual place near the HOA clubhouse. The lake seemed too calm, too glassy, like whatever hunted underneath had gone quiet only to circle deeper. On the third morning, just after sunrise, mist curled across the water like drifting smoke. My phone rang. Sarah. "Remy," she said, her voice clipped with urgency. "The county has scheduled an emergency hearing. Today at 2. Today? They're reviewing the HOA's actions, the covenant forgery, and the developer filings. We have one chance to lay everything out before the Planning Commission approves anything else." A quiet shiver of relief moved through me. Not victory, just a direction. "I'll be there," I said. "You need to bring the original deed," she added, "and every map your grandfather left." I glanced at the large folder on my table. Yellowed maps, brittle surveys, decades of handwriting. "Already packed." "Good," she said. "It's time." The courthouse sat 30 miles east, a sandstone building older than most towns in the county. I drove there in my old green pickup, engine rumbling steady, the lake receding behind me in the mirror. The road wound through pine forests and low hills, passing streams swollen from last week's rain. Every bend reminded me what was at stake. Not just property, legacy. When I reached the courthouse parking lot, Sarah was already outside, hair tied back, a heavy binder against her chest. She gave me a tight smile. "You ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." Inside, the hearing room buzzed like a kicked beehive. Wooden benches filled quickly, HOA residents, concerned neighbors, reporters from the small county newspaper, even a few curious locals who'd heard rumors of a lake war. A projector screen flickered at the front, displaying zoning maps and aerial photos. At the center table sat the Planning Commission. 5 officials in dark suits, all appearing more tired than dangerous. And then, on the far right side of the room, I saw him. Evan Larkin, the developer's representative. Calm, silent. Hands folded neatly on the table before him. The kind of man who could watch a storm roll in without flinching. Beside him sat a woman in a tailored gray suit, another Harper and Lyle attorney, no doubt. Their table had stacks of folders, legal pads, and a single polished fountain pen resting perfectly aligned with the edge. Behind them, a cluster of HOA board members huddled anxiously, but Bethany's seat remained empty. Sarah nudged me. "She's not coming." "She's scared," I said quietly. "Good," Sarah replied. "She should be." The commissioners called the hearing to order. First up, the HOA's defense. A nervous board member approached the microphone, hands shaking around a packet of papers. We acted under the belief that the lake had transitioned into shared watershed management," he said. "Environmental concerns have been rising." One commissioner cut him off. "Did you obtain signatures for the covenant change?" "We attempted to notify legacy residents. That wasn't my question." Silence. The board member swallowed hard. "No, we did not." A murmur rippled across the benches. Next came the environmental claims. Photos flashed on the screen. My dock, my canoe, the shoreline. Then a commissioner held up one of the violation notices. "This device referenced here," he said, tapping the form. "The contamination meter. What model is it? What agency certified it?" No one answered. "Is it even real?" he pressed. One board member exhaled in defeat. Measures humidity. Laughter broke out in the room. Even the commissioners couldn't suppress smirks. Then it was Harper and Lyle's turn. Larkin rose smoothly, buttoning his coat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, voice steady as a level beam. "Our involvement in this matter is strictly professional. Our company planned a marina expansion to stimulate local growth and enhance tourism. We entered negotiations assuming the HOA represented collective shoreline interests." Sarah leaned toward me. "Listen carefully. He'll try to shift blame." Sure enough, Larkin continued, "If any documents were incorrectly filed or signatures overlooked, Harper and Lyle was not party to that process. We trusted the HOA's representations. Our goals were, and remain, beneficial to the community." A commissioner frowned. "Were you aware the lake is privately owned?" Larkin's eyes flicked briefly toward me, then back. "We were informed there were unresolved legacy rights. We anticipated cooperation." "Cooperation," I said under my breath. "By force?" Sarah rested a warning hand on my arm. "Not yet," she whispered. Finally, the commission shifted. "Mr. Cole," the chairwoman said, "please step forward." I stood, straightened my jacket, and approached the microphone. The room felt hotter than before, every breath thick, every sound amplified. But when I looked at the commissioners, at Sarah beside me, and at the deed in my hand, the weight eased. "This lake," I began, voice steady, "has been in my family for nearly a century. My grandfather built the dam. He surveyed every contour. He fought for the water rights that I hold today." I held up the deed. "These aren't vague claims. They're recorded, filed, undisputed for 90 years. The Cole family owns the lakebed, the water column, and the full shoreline on our parcel." The projector displayed a scanned copy of the deed. Gasps filled the room again. I continued. "The HOA rewrote a covenant without my signature. They issued fines they had no jurisdiction to impose. They attempted to restrict access to water they don't own. And they submitted zoning documents implying shared control." I paused, looking directly at the commissioners. "That is not enforcement. That is appropriation." Sarah stepped forward with a stack of documents. "We also have evidence," she said, "that the HOA transferred thousands in resident fees to a shell company belonging to its president. Filing dates correlate directly with drafts for the marina expansion." A commissioner looked to Larkin. "Care to respond?" For the first time, the developer rep's expression wavered. Barely, but enough to show cracks forming. "Harper and Lyle," he said, "was not aware of any financial irregularities." "That's not what your emails show," Sarah said sharply. Gasps again. Larkin froze. She placed the printed email excerpt, the same one I found in the envelope, onto the table before the commissioners. The commission chairwoman studied it, brows pulling together. "This," she said slowly, "is damning." The room fell utterly silent. A fan hummed overhead. The lake wind rattled an old window pane. Somewhere in the back row, someone whispered a prayer or a curse. It was hard to tell. After several minutes of deliberation, the commissioners returned. Their ruling came crisp and final. "All fines issued to Mr. Cole are voided. The HOA acted outside its authority. The developer's permit request is suspended pending a full investigation. Furthermore, the county recommends criminal review regarding forged documents and misappropriation of funds." Relief washed through me, not in a burst, but like a slow tide rising, steady, controlled, unstoppable. Behind me, residents murmured, some in anger, some in disbelief, some in cautious hope. Harper and Lyle's attorney began packing documents with rapid, clipped motions. Larkin's jaw set, his expression unreadable but darkening at the edges. He wasn't defeated, but he'd been forced to retreat. When the hearing concluded, Sarah clapped a hand on my back. "You did good," she said. No, I replied softly, glancing out the window toward the lake shimmering in afternoon light. We did good, she smiled. This isn't the end. I know. Because as I stepped outside into the cool air and the smell of damp pine, something tugged at the edge of my mind. Bethany's voice from the dock. You don't understand who wants your lake. And she was right. I understood who didn't want to lose it, but not yet who was willing to cross every line to take it. For a long moment after the ruling, I just stood outside the courthouse steps, breathing in the crisp mountain air. It carried the faint scent of wet pine and distant lake water, like the world itself was exhaling with me. People filtered out behind us, some shaking hands, some whispering, some staring at me with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. I didn't blame them. Most had just realized how close they came to losing everything to a scheme they never saw happening in their own backyard. But the real test wasn't over, not even close. Sarah joined me on the steps. Tomorrow, she said, adjusting the strap of her satchel, the HOA board meets to determine next steps. They'll need to restructure everything Bethany touched. Everything? I asked. She nodded. Which is a lot. Behind her, the sun broke through the cloud cover, scattering bands of gold across the courthouse lawn. For the first time in weeks, the light felt warm instead of harsh, hopeful instead of threatening. Marcus joined us a few minutes later. Judge wants a formal report filed, he said. Fraud charges will move ahead against Bethany, and the developer's paperwork is already under state review. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd waited a long time to see justice catch up with arrogance. But something still gnawed at me. What about Harper and Lyle's next move? I asked quietly. Marcus's jaw tightened. They'll regroup, they always do, but they can't touch your water rights, not now, not after today. I wanted to believe him. I also knew better. That night, back at the cabin, the lake was unusually still. The surface looked like a sheet of dark glass, unbroken by wind or current. Even the frogs along the reeds seemed muted. Their croaks softened into the night. I stood at the end of my dock, hands in my pockets, letting moonlight glint off the water's ripples. A small envelope rested in those same pockets, the one I retrieved from my porch before leaving for the courthouse. I'd opened it only after returning. Inside was a single blank card, except for one line. We'll be in touch. No name, no signature, no company letterhead. Just certainty. I slipped it away. Tonight wasn't for threats. Tonight was for decisions. Because the HOA was broke now, Bethany had drained their funds chasing a deal she never understood. And her mistakes left the community struggling with debts they didn't deserve. Good people lived across that lake. People who'd been misled, manipulated, scared into silence. They weren't the enemy. The system was. So when morning came, I put on a clean shirt, gathered the documents I'd sorted with Sarah, and drove across the lake road to the emergency HOA meeting. They held it in the Marina Boathouse, a place that normally smelled of sunscreen, rope, and lake water. Today it smelled of tension. Dozens of residents packed the wooden benches. Some avoided my gaze. Others gave small nods of appreciation. And on the stage sat an exhausted interim board, people who looked like they hadn't slept since the hearing. Sarah stood beside me, arms crossed. Marcus lingered near the back, more presence than participant. The board president, a man named Lowell who'd taken over after Bethany's removal, cleared his throat. We owe Mr. Cole an apology, he said, voice trembling slightly. The HOA acted outside its authority. Many of us trusted leadership we shouldn't have, and our community is now in financial trouble because of it. Murmurs filled the room. He continued, We have fees to repay, debts to address, and residents who deserve better. So we're asking, Mr. Cole, is there any path forward? Any agreement we can reach regarding ongoing use of the marina and lake access? Every head turned toward me. The lake glimmered through the boathouse window, emerald under the morning sun. The same lake my grandfather built, the same lake Bethany tried to take, and the same lake whose silence last night finally gave me the answer. I stepped forward. There is a path, I said, but it has to be clean, legal, transparent. People leaned in. You keep the marina, your boats, your docks, your amenities. I'm not interested in shutting anyone out. I paused. But the lake is privately owned. It always has been. And private use requires a private agreement. A wave of dread swept the room. Residents imagining expensive contracts, sky-high restrictions. So I continued. I'm offering a long-term access agreement, $5,000 a year. Gasps, whispering, a few stunned looks. I raised a hand. That's not per household. That's total. One fee, paid annually by the HOA. Consider it a lease to support lake maintenance, dam inspections, water quality, and community use. Lowell blinked. 5,000 total? Yes. Silence exploded into relief. Shoulders dropped. A woman near the front covered her mouth with her hands. Why? She whispered. After everything they did to you? I looked out over the room. The worried parents, the retirees, the boat owners who just wanted to paddle on weekends. Because this isn't your fault, I said. And because my grandfather used to say water's meant to be shared, just not stolen. A few people laughed through tears. Lowell wiped his glasses. We'll vote now. It wasn't close. Unanimously approved. After the meeting, residents filed out slowly, some stopping to shake my hand, others offering baked goods, fishing tips, heartfelt apologies. It felt healing. But it wasn't until I stepped outside, into the bright, warm air, that the moment truly settled. I walked down to the marina edge, watching sunlight flicker across the rippling green water. This lake had held my family's history. Today, it held my victory. A soft breeze drifted across the docks, carrying the scent of cedar and sun-warmed wood. For the first time in weeks, the water looked like itself again. Calm, open, free. I closed my eyes. They fined me $1,000 for touching my own lake, I murmured. Then I smiled. Now they pay me $5,000 a year just to touch it. I started walking back toward my truck, but paused. A black SUV sat parked near the tree line, engine off, windows tinted, aim pointed toward the marina. Watching. By the time I blinked, it pulled away silently, tires crunching on gravel, disappearing between the pines as if it had never been there. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it wasn't. Either way, the lake was mine. The truth was out. The battle was over. And something else had just begun. If you've ever had to stand your ground against an HOA, or anyone who tried to take what's yours, drop a simple yes in the comments so I know I'm not alone out here. Remember, justice doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just stands firm and refuses to move. And if you want more true-to-life lake, ranch, and land justice stories like this one, feel free to subscribe. I'd love to have you here for the next fight.